On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, welcome to the first webinar of 2012. I'm Pamela Blue, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. This afternoon's webinar, the first of two sessions on institutional repositories, is presented by Isaac Gilman, the Scholarly Communications and Research Services Librarian at Pacific University, located about halfway between Portland and the magnificent Oregon coast. Isaac manages Pacific's institutional repository, Common Knowledge, and provides support for several open access journals published at the university. In 2011, Isaac and his colleague Marissa Ramirez from Cal Poly established the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communication, whose inaugural issue will be published this spring, so watch out for that. In his presentation entitled Services Lead to Success, Strategies for Repository Growth, Isaac will describe a variety of approaches repository managers can use to increase the repository scope within the academic community. If you have questions for Isaac, please type them into the question box on your screen. At the conclusion of his presentation, Isaac will answer as many questions as time permits. Any questions which are not answered during the Q&A session will be answered offline and the responses sent to all attendees. Today's session will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording at the conclusion of the webinar together with a copy of Isaac's slides. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, our hashtag is hashtag ALCTS, ALCTSCE. Now, as I turn the presentation over to Isaac, there may be a slight delay.
Hi, sorry, just getting things set up. So I'd like to thank Pamela and ALCTS for this opportunity to speak with you today. I always really enjoy sharing what we're doing at Pacific. So just so that you have a face to put with my disembodied voice, here's a picture, circa 2006 or so. So as Pamela mentioned, I manage Pacific's repository, which we've had since 2009, and also I've been involved in helping to draft copyright usage guidelines and a revised intellectual property policy for Pacific, in addition to co-chairing Pacific's IRB. And we'll talk a little bit later about how all those things kind of come into play when thinking about some of the legal and ethical issues related to managing a repository. And although Pamela already plugged this for me, I do want to just offer another shameless plug that we are accepting submissions for JList. The inaugural issue is coming out this spring, and we'd be thrilled to get submissions from you if you have any kind of repository project that you're working on. Do you think others would benefit from learning about? I'd really encourage you to write something and submit it for one of our upcoming issues. I think that institutional context is always helpful when you hear someone talk, because it gives you a little bit of a sense of what resources they might have and whether you would be able to do something similar or better with what you have at your institution. So just a little bit about Pacific. Pacific is a relatively small, private, historically liberal arts university, but we also have rapidly expanding professional programs in the health professions, as well as colleges of education and optometry. And in our libraries, we have 7 faculty and 10 staff spread out across 2 different campuses. As I mentioned, our repository, Common Knowledge, was launched in June 2009, so we're just a few months shy of our 3rd birthday, and I think we're doing pretty well so far. I think it's important to note up front what repository platform we use, because its ability to manage a variety of types of content is key to what we've been able to do. So for example, we can publish online journals through our repository, whereas with some other platforms, we would have needed to implement a separate system like OJS in order to have that capacity. However, for those of you that aren't using Digital Commons, I do think the strategies I'm going to talk about are largely platform agnostic. So some fair warning. I'm about to make some broad generalizations about librarians and about our users. but I don't think that they're that far off. So hopefully you agree. So when libraries first start thinking about implementing an IR, I think it's common for our motivations to be really closely tied to what we're interested in. We're interested in building collections, we're interested in digitization projects, we want to support open access, we think things like metadata harvestry and interoperable platforms are really cool and fun and important. But obviously our users aren't us, and I think sometimes we forget that. Our users are busy people who need services that can make their lives easier. So we can build the best collection in our repository, but if that collection isn't of a direct benefit to them in some way, it's not going to get the same level of attention or buy-in. I think another way to think about it is if you think about the context of interlibrary loan or document delivery. Faculty like that we have the journals that they need in our collection, but they really love it if we're able to provide them with desktop delivery of journal articles, whether we're scanning them from our collection or getting them somewhere else through ILL. So the collections are vital, but it's the services that really get noticed and that people really love. So given that generalization that our user communities are going to be most interested and most responsive to services, let me offer what I'm calling the 4 premises of IR success. First is that a repository has to be necessary in order for it to be successful. Second, that valuable collections are a byproduct of necessary services. Third, services should actively support an institution's mission, values, and goals. And finally, fourth, services will create dialogue and beget new services. So, premise 1. In order for a repository to be successful, we need to identify or create a context in which the repository is recognized as being necessary. It would be really nice if all that it took to do that was to create that context or environment, was to design some posters and throw them up around campus. I enjoy doing that. It's fun, but unfortunately it takes a little bit more than that. Marketing is important, but we need to move beyond kind of simple marketing. So I think to create an environment in which people outside the library view the repository as necessary, there needs to be a shared understanding of a need that the repository can meet. At Pacific, we began to cultivate that understanding by partnering with our newly formed Office of Research to talk about ways in which the office and the library could collaborate to create an environment and an infrastructure on campus that would support student and faculty scholarly activities. With both a newly minted Vice Provost of Research and Director of Undergraduate Research positions, there's clearly been a new emphasis on research at Pacific and a corresponding need for the services to support that scholarly activity. So as part of this conversation, to try and reach a shared understanding of what the needs were, we attended the ARL-ACRL Scholarly Communication Institute together, which allowed us to, importantly I think, learn together, but also to gain even a common vocabulary and a common conception of what some of these ideas were. And I think it really enriched our dialogue to go through that process together with someone from outside of the library. So as an outcome of those conversations that we were having, this statement was drafted. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I want to point out a few things. You can see it says something like an institutional repository is urgently needed. It's good to see. And then it goes on to talk about storing, managing, and disseminating academic products, sharing with colleagues here and elsewhere, there being opportunities for faculty to gain access to the wider scholarly community, and finally, the university's reputation, establishing a significant profile in the knowledge community. And I think the best thing about this understanding, this statement that came out of those conversations, was that it was not our university librarian that drafted this statement. It was the Vice Provost for Research. So an important outcome of the conversations that the Vice Provost and the university librarian and I were having was that we had the opportunity to make a presentation to the deans and directors and the provost at our institution, in which we shared our ideas for the environment we wanted to create and the role that the repository could play in it. So these are just a few slides that I've excerpted from that presentation. So talking about possibilities at Pacific, that we had a plan to create an environment that would support research and scholarly activity and that would establish the university as a leader. And one of the things that we highlighted was that it would be helpful to have a system to collect and disseminate student and faculty research to make Pacific more visible worldwide and obviously get it on Google, which everyone likes. And so we put forth this idea of what that system could be, which was an institutional repository. And our hope was that by having this repository and some other systems and processes and infrastructure pieces, that we would create this environment that would support research and scholarly activity at the university. So while it is vitally important to create a context at that administrative level to have those conversations with provosts, with the academic affairs, with other administrators, it's also really key to identify contexts at more granular levels with individuals or departments, identifying those contexts in which the repository will be useful for them. So for an example, at Pacific, conversations that we had with the faculty in our College of Optometry led to us fast-tracking our repository implementation so that we could host conference materials for them. So as you'll see right here, these are some slides that we shared during a presentation with our optometry faculty immediately prior to implementing our repository. And the message that we shared with the College of Optometry is different than the one we shared at the administrative level. It's focused on the benefits of open access and open educational resources, and even on open innovation. So our optometry faculty do research for Nike, and there's some long-standing partnerships there. And so it was good for us to be able to pull out something like this, to be able to point to the fact that openness and the kind of sharing that a repository could facilitate was something that was useful even in a corporate context, and in a specific corporate context they were familiar with. So the bottom line, whether you need to build a context or whether you simply need to be able to identify one that exists, is that a repository and a repository program is not going to succeed in a vacuum. At least that's what I believe. There needs to be environmental conditions that make its necessity apparent to people outside of the library, and ideally to people across the institution. So creating this framework within which the repository can be viewed as a vital service is obviously helpful for getting it off the ground, as we experienced with our optometry faculty, where we were able to share with them that the repository could help them by hosting a conference, and they wanted to do it, and there was a need to do that, and so it helped us to get the repository off the ground. So it can be helpful for implementation, getting that kind of initial push, but it's also really key to sustaining the success of the program and the repository. And I think the thing that's most helpful in consistently being able to present the repository in this way is to intentionally cultivate a service orientation, which brings us to the second premise, that repository collections will grow, and not just in size but also in quality, by focusing not on content recruitment or collection building, but on service delivery. So the question that I always have in my mind when I meet with anyone, sorry, advanced too soon there. When I meet with anyone is how can we use the repository to meet a need that you have? I think it's helpful to think about repository services in this way, kind of this tripartite way that I have here up on the screen. A truly useful service is going to come out of a real need. And in order to identify real needs, you need to have a clear understanding of what is important to a particular person or department. And before you can understand them, you need to have a relationship with them. And this is really not a revolutionary idea. If you think about it, it's the same process that a subject specialist or liaison librarian would go through to help build a collection in a particular discipline. Only here, we're more focused on building services, not collections. Collections collections will be a byproduct of this focus, but we are focused on identifying services that can meet needs. At Pacific, I think we've been pretty successful with this approach with a variety of different constituencies across campuses, but one example that I keep returning to and that I keep sharing, mostly because it illustrates my point so well, is that of our College of Health Professions. And so just kind of walking through this progression within the College of Health Professions, you need a relationship first and foremost. And for me, I was able to build that relationship because I was doing some instruction in the college, bibliographic instruction. And not being from a medical or health background, I had a genuine need and interest in trying to understand more about how to better provide that instruction, how to better provide other services that were going to be useful to these programs. And so through conversations and through my attempts to reach this understanding, I came to one kind of basic conclusion that they really care about the quality of care and the quality of the providers that are being created, and that evidence-based practice is a key component to providing quality care and quality education. And from that understanding, once I understood that evidence-based practice was really a core element to what they were about, it was kind of easy to take the next step and say, okay, well, based on that understanding, what is a need? And obviously to do evidence-based practice, which for those of you who don't come from a health background, in its simplest form just means that you're basing your decisions on evidence, on research. So to do evidence-based practice, you need to have access to the evidence. So with that understanding that one need that we could meet and potentially meet through the repository was to help provide access to evidence to inform education and care, let me walk you through a few different case studies from our College of Health Professions that kind of illustrate our partnership with them. And I'm just framing them as case studies to keep with the health professions theme. So one service that we've been able to provide to them is to host and provide access to materials that would otherwise be lost on various kind of faculty member hard drives. So the college hosts these interprofessional case conferences where educators and providers and students come together and discuss the care of a patient from an interprofessional perspective and how each of those professions is going to interact in that, in caring for that patient. And so from those conferences, there are handouts, there are slides, and those weren't really going anywhere. They were just being taken back to the offices of the faculty that had organized the conference. So I offered to collect those and kind of provide perpetual access to them through the repository. And that one, it meets that need and is consistent with the college's mission by providing access to information that's helpful to other health professions educators and potentially other health professionals. But it also has the benefit of increasing visibility for the college and highlighting the college's emphasis on interprofessional care. And another neat benefit that I've highlighted here is that we had a faculty member who had written an article about one of these interprofessional case conferences. And as part of the article, wanted to provide access to the original case conference materials, but the journal that they published in didn't have a facility to provide access to supplemental materials. And so the faculty member simply linked back to the materials that were hosted in the repository. So we were able to provide that access to those materials, and that in a way that really enhanced that faculty member's scholarship. We also, through the repository, provide what is really a traditional repository service by hosting faculty publications. And this pretty clearly meets the need for providing access to evidence-based information, because this is the best information. It's coming from peer-reviewed journals. But in doing this, we also try to make it as easy as possible for faculty to submit and to feel good about having their work online by formatting postprints for them if they're not able to post the publisher's version, by going through the process of checking on the rights to see what they can post. We really try to be a full-service shop for the faculty. So in a presentation that I gave to the faculty, the health professions faculty, I emphasized both the altruistic service, kind of providing access to evidence, and then also the more personal service, the benefits of wider visibility to work, of a persistent home for their scholarship, etc. And so I think both of these resonate with faculty, and one maybe more than another, depending on who the faculty member is. So I think it's important to present both sides of this perspective, that we can provide service to the discipline, to the greater community, to the greater healthcare community by providing access, but we can also provide service to you as an individual by providing these benefits to you of making your work more widely available, of making your work more persistently available, and of even doing things like providing usage data so that you get a sense of how often your work is being downloaded, how often it's being used, and people like that. They like to know that their work is being used. We've, kind of moving on to a different case, we've had an especially productive partnership with our School of Occupational Therapy. As a bit of background, OT does have an evidence-based focus like other health disciplines, so they are making a conscious effort to make sure that their practice is informed by the research evidence. But they also have a need as a discipline to grow the body of evidence that's available to inform their education, their client care. The body of evidence that's there for OT just isn't as large as it is for some other professions. And so I've worked with the faculty to help them contribute their work to the IR, but some of our most successful collections have been of occupational therapy student work. And so these are, we identified a couple of types of student work that the faculty felt would be appropriate to share, which were these critically appraised topics and their innovative practice projects, which is really their culminating project. And the innovative practice projects, which are, the critically appraised topics, which are analyses of research articles that are related to a specific clinical question, have been some of our most downloaded items, which is nice for us, but more importantly, they've been a clear way that the students have been able to make a meaningful contribution to their profession's knowledge base. And I think that's really resonated with both the faculty and the students, and especially for the students when we're able to share with them how often these things are being used, because obviously we don't know who's using them, but we can infer, and I think the students do too, that whoever is using them is finding them useful and that they are probably other OTs or OT students. The final case, and the final example from our College of Health Professions that I want to share is a Interprofessional Healthcare Journal that I've helped some of the faculty, both from our College of Health Professions and our College of Optometry, I've helped them start. And so the journal obviously builds on the interprofessional focus of the institution, but it also completes what I like to think of as a suite of services for the college. So for every type of scholarly work that is generated by students or faculty, we are able to and do provide a service to support them, either in the creation of the work or in sharing their work. So everything from student work, where we had ETDs, for example, in our School of Psychology, moving to a digital submission model as a service that saves money and also increases access to the work. And then students, like in the OT program, coursework that would otherwise have just kind of probably languished in their own files, and they're able to have a venue to contribute that to their discipline and to other people and to the kind of the world at large. And then we are providing access to faculty work like the Interprofessional Conference, case conference presentations, or presentations they give at other conferences, other forms of grade literature. And then we're providing greater access to work that's previously been published. And finally, with the journal and with that publishing support, we have a venue for original research, original work that hasn't been published elsewhere, but the faculty just don't want to put up. They want it to go through that peer review process, and now we have a way to do that. And it's open not just to Pacific faculty, but to anyone around the world. And it's the repository that allows us to provide these services. And if you recall, kind of providing support across this continuum of activities connects really nicely when we think about creating that infrastructure to support student and faculty scholarship that we had discussions about with the vice provost. We presented to to the provost and the deans and directors as being our vision for how the university could support these activities. So when you're thinking about developing services, I think it's important to keep these guidelines in mind. First, you really want to try to provide services that are going to in some way enhance the educational process. We are an educational institution, and so anytime you can provide a service that enhances the process for faculty or students or both, that service is going to be recognized as having value. Services that allow faculty and students to contribute in meaningful ways to their disciplines. Again, just like the OT students, if you can provide a service that not only allows people to feel like they're contributing to their discipline, but where they actually are contributing to their discipline by making their knowledge available to others, that's meaningful. And you also want to try and provide services that are going to be ultimately in service of the core values of the group that you're working with. So in our College of Health Professions, we wanted to provide services that we could really connect clearly to something like evidence-based practice. And so making that connection between providing access to the evidence and evidence-based practice was a clear connection for us. And finally, whatever the service is, you really want it to be meaningful to the person that's receiving it and the person that's using it, not just to the library. And one thing that I think above all else, and I'll probably return to this before the presentation is over, that you need to remember that the repository is not an end unto itself, that it's going to be most successful if you're able to frame the repository as being in service of some greater goal. And speaking of that, premise 3. So if the services you're providing are truly useful and necessary, it should be easy to connect them to your institution's mission, values, and goals. So as an example, these are elements from Pacific's mission, but I think they're fairly common across institutions. So we have kind of core values of teaching and learning, scholarship, sustainability, diversity, and civic engagement. And I've just kind of pulled out ways that I think a repository can really help support and connect to those values. So for example, civic engagement, we're providing equitable access to information. Scholarship, we're providing new venues for scholarly exchange, we're providing greater visibility that can lead to new collaborations for our students and faculty. So I think when you sit down and think about it, there are usually some pretty clear connections you can make between your university's mission and services or ways that the repository can support that mission. In addition to connecting the repository services at the 30,000-foot level, in other words, to the mission, it's also useful to be able to make connections to more concrete goals and objectives. So, for example, the university is interested in recruiting and retaining intelligent, motivated students and faculty. They're interested in maintaining a record of the scholarly output of the institution. They're interested in delivering services that help distinguish the university from comparator institutions. And so, for example, looking at the first one, recruiting and retaining students and faculty, it can be helpful to sit down and think about ways the repository can be used to recognize achievement, can be used to support people that are already here, but can also be used to recruit people that aren't here, prospective students, potential faculty members. I had an interesting conversation with the head of our Career Development Center a couple weeks ago, and he's on a student retention committee, and he was interested in whether we could look at ways to use the repository to help him connect with students, because it's most helpful for him if he knows what students are interested in and what their academic interests are, because then he can connect with them individually rather than just saying in general, look, you need to update your CV, you need to get an internship. And so having their work available in the repository would provide even just something as simple as a conversation starter for him, or a way to learn more about the students and connect with them in a way that would be effective in both making them successful when they are at Pacific, but then also helping them transition successfully out of Pacific. So it depends on your circumstance, but I think there are going to be opportunities to identify ways that you can use the repository to meet some really practical objectives of your institution. I think it's really important that when you're making these connections to mission, to goals, that you're not keeping them to yourself. I think sharing these connections is a really important way of demonstrating the need for the repository. So at Pacific, we've done this in various ways. For example, I put together an annual report on the repository that we share with administrators. We've met with administrators to discuss funding for the repository services, and at the same time the benefits the repository brings to the institution, like promoting it and showcasing the quality of work that takes place here. And the library director also includes highlights of repository activities and services in a report that gets sent to the Board of Trustees. So whatever it is at your institution, I think it's vital to make sure that people are aware of what's happening and that they are aware that what you're doing is explicitly connected to what the institution is all about. Although it may seem a little bit like preaching to the choir, it's also important for the long-term sustainability of repository services, I think, to make clear connections to them in the library's own planning documents and language, not just at the institutional level. So for example, at Pacific, we formed a new team, Local Collections and Publication Services, that includes myself, our archivist, and our metadata librarian, under this umbrella of Local Collections and Publications, which provides a formal relationship for coordination and planning purposes, and also, importantly, I think helps others in the library recognize that this is a service area that we're committed to. At the same time, we've also been working on revising our core themes within the library in anticipation of accreditation. And you can see, these are just some drafts of a few of our themes, that there's some clear language that speaks directly to services that the repository provides. Preserving the scholarly and creative achievements of students, faculty, and staff, providing a virtual commons that will support the discovery of new ideas and opportunities to engage local and global communities, disseminating knowledge, creating policies and venues that foster ethical and sustainable publishing practices. I mean, this is very intentional language on our part because we want to make sure that both now and in the future, the repository and related activities are seen as being really core to what the library does, and being a core way that the library supports the institution. The bottom line, whether you're thinking about making connections to the institution's mission or to the library's mission, is that you are enabling yourself to answer the question, why do you have a repository? Or why is this important? When strategic planning takes place, when priorities get set, especially at the institutional level, the initiatives and the services that are most clearly connected to your mission are those that are going to be sustained, and probably those that will get funded as well. So it's really important to articulate these connections for ourselves so that we're able to answer this question when it comes up, and to answer it convincingly. So premise 4. Once you've identified a context in which the repository is necessary and identified services that meet real needs in your community, and then made sure that those services are explicitly connected to the mission of your institution, you should be in pretty good shape with your repository. It should be there for the long haul. But I think there's one final benefit to having this service orientation because, and pardon the Star Trek reference, but services are kind of like tribbles. If you have one successful one, you're going to have a lot more pretty soon. So I think by providing services through the repository and providing a range of services through the repository, the campus community begins to see the library as a potential partner in ways that it hadn't considered before. And sometimes in amusing ways. For example, I was asked a while ago if I could update something on the university's homepage. And obviously I don't have access to the university's homepage, but it was nice to think that someone thought I could do that. And I think that's largely because of what we've been doing with the repository. People just don't know where we're going to pop up anymore, so they figure, well, I'll ask the library. And I think that kind of uncertainty about what category the library fits in leads to questions about whether the library can help with a certain this or with that. Like, can the library host a journal for us? Can you help us get all of our faculty scholarship into a collection online so that our creditors can look at it easily when they come to visit? Can you put up a conference website for us? And these are all things that Pacific were able to do through the repository. And when you do that successfully, when you provide those services, people do notice. And that success then leads to new opportunities. So a good example, I want to go back to the School of Occupational Therapy. I've worked closely with them to develop opportunities, obviously, for both students and faculty to share their work through the repository. But then as a result of those conversations and building those relationships over time, we've recently entered into an agreement with an occupational science society that some of our OT faculty are involved in to host their conference proceedings. And so we've uploaded the back file of all their abstracts from their past conferences, and we are going to be hosting their conference schedule and abstracts going forward. And we're also going to be working with them to try and add conference papers that aren't going to be published elsewhere onto the site so that knowledge will be available, and this can be a resource for people that are interested in occupational science. And then further on down the road, there's also the potential that we would start an online journal with them. So from something as simple as starting with collecting faculty articles, we've come to the place where we're hosting a society conference and could one day be hosting a society journal. I think there's a clear connection in that relationship. So successful repository services don't just breed more repository service opportunities, though. I think the repository successful support for scholarship can lead to other types of partnerships and opportunities. Because, hey, if the library can do this, what can't we do? Obviously, we can't do everything, but we can become involved in the scholarly life of our community in new ways that, of course, are tied to our mission and support the university's mission. So, for example, at Pacific, the library this year is a partner in a proposal for a new undergraduate minor in editing and publishing. And we've also been able to offer the repository as support for faculty open access resolutions. And we're working on developing a faculty grant program similar to those at UMass and Temple for the use or creation of open educational resources. And what better place to host locally created open educational resources than the repository if that ends up being a successful program. So I think ideally we end up with something that looks like this, where the repository is just one piece of an ecosystem of services that are closely tied to both library and university mission and objectives, and that meet the needs of our user communities, not just our need to have really cool repositories with massive download counts. I think ultimately having a repository that is inextricably tied to other initiatives and services will lead to a much more successful repository program than if the repository is a lone island, kind of disconnected from a larger purpose or mission. So I held out on you. There is a fifth premise. And an important piece of having a service orientation is being flexible. With a repository, I think that really means keeping an open mind about what a repository can and should be used for, and kind of how you conceive of a repository and how you conceive of repository collections. So some examples at Pacific, our repository is used as a way for alumni of our MFA in writing program share news. So they've created a collection where alumni can use a submission form to submit a news item, submit news about a publication they just published. And we've also experimented with using the repository as a place to host training and professional development materials. And I know of other institutions that are building collections of, for example, campus maps and blueprints. I think they're doing that at Cal Poly. And I think, and our openness to hosting content that was already hosted elsewhere, which you might otherwise not want to do. If something's already openly available, there may not seem to be a point to hosting the repository. But I think our openness in one instance to do that has led to some additional opportunities to provide services. And I'm specifically thinking about this case where a faculty member in our College of Education had a book, and it was posted online as a series of web pages. And I offered to reformat it as a PDF so that it could be easily downloaded and printed, and we put it up in the IR using this monograph, kind of multi-object series type. And so since then, I've also worked with the same faculty member to post podcasts from his students. And this fall, our repository is going to be providing the conference website for a conference that he helps to organize. And all of that came from being willing to host something in the repository that wasn't necessarily unique, that was already available elsewhere. And so I think it's good to be flexible and to be open to different types of opportunities and different ways that you can use the repository, not just in ways that you would imagine it, but in ways that other people can imagine it as well. And now for something that is not completely different, but a little bit different. And I'm going to call it the sixth premise because, hey, I'm on a roll. So sixth premise it is. So I think a repository program is ultimately not going to be successful in the long term if it's not governed by ethical and legal practices. You can provide all the services you want. You can be entirely service-oriented. You can please people every day of the week. But if the way in which you're doing it does not conform to necessary ethical and legal guidelines, ultimately you're going to get in trouble in the end, and well, no one wants that. So I have a few thoughts about that. So as repository managers and as people that host repositories, we really try to find unique, unpublished content that we can provide access to. I mean, that's what really makes the repository cool, at least in my mind, is yes, we can provide open access to journal articles that otherwise people would have to pay for, but the really neat part is when we can provide access to materials that would otherwise not have any access point, where they would be lost on someone's hard drive or stuck in someone's drawer. And so we provide access to information that no one can get any other way. And that usually and hopefully makes our repository distinct. But it also means that because we are sharing unique, unpublished content, that we have a little more responsibility to vet that content before we put it online. It's not as if we're putting up a copy of an article that has gone through a publishing process, that's gone through editorial review by a publisher, and so we have some sense that there is some quality control. With unpublished work, there is not necessarily as much external quality control, and so we need to be responsible for part of that if we're going to put it online. So I just want to highlight a few common issues that I've run into in working with our repository and which I think are really important to pay attention to. So the first one is privacy, the issue of privacy and what you're putting up online. And for people in an educational institution, and specifically in the United States, but I'm sure there are similar laws elsewhere, FERPA is an issue. So the Family Educational, I'm going to mess this up, but we'll just say FERPA. And what we need to be thinking about is the student work that we're putting online, does it constitute an educational record under FERPA? And therefore, do we need to have special permission from the student to put that work online? And I apologize, I have a typo here, but language, I think language in a submission form can easily address this to make it clear that when a student is submitting work that they are acknowledging that their work might constitute an educational record under FERPA, and so they give us permission to disclose it. I would note too that Marisa Ramirez and Gail McMillan have a really good article specifically related to FERPA and ETDs, and I've linked to it down below, so you can check it out when you get the slides. But I think that's an issue to be aware of. In the same way, your university might have a privacy policy like we do at Pacific that's even stricter than FERPA. And this means that even at our institution, we can't share directory information which would be allowable under FERPA, things like student names, without getting student permission. So we can't post something in our repository and identify the student as an author without getting that student's permission. So that's not necessarily, it's not a legal issue, but it is kind of an ethical and local policy issue. Then if you're dealing with any kind of medicine or health-based collections, and you might be putting up something that's based on real data, you need to think about whether the data was properly identified, whether it was used properly under HIPAA. Again, this is a U.S. Act dealing with privacy of health information. But if you have any kind of collections that deal with real data, real health data, I would recommend looking into HIPAA. Research ethics are another issue. So, for example, if you put up undergraduate student papers and maybe the student has done some research, you need to know if it's human subjects research, did it receive proper IRB review, or if it's animal research, did it receive proper IACUC review, or so on or so forth. And I think this is something that can be fairly easily addressed again on a submission form where you provide a checkbox where the student has to indicate whether or not IRB review was required and whether or not IRB approval was obtained. Because you don't want to be disseminating work, especially human subjects research, that did not receive the appropriate ethical approval. There could be not only, there's not only ethical ramifications, but there could be huge legal ramifications for your institution. So if you have questions about that kind of thing, I recommend starting a dialogue with your IRB chair, your IRB committee. Finally, intellectual property, obviously a big issue with repositories, and so I will just mention kind of one aspect to this that we've run into at Pacific, and that is what is your policy going to be regarding fair use? Are you going to require people to obtain permissions for all copyrighted material, third-party copyrighted material that they include in unpublished work, like say a conference poster, or a paper submitted at a conference, or a PowerPoint presentation? Are you going to require permission for their use of any material, photos, images, in their work, or are you going to be okay with fair use? At Pacific, we've decided that it's not practical for the library to be the copyright police, and we've also decided that we want fair use to be an option for our community members. And so we have a policy, as there's a little snapshot here, that clearly states that we're not going to review for compliance with copyright law the content of unpublished materials that are submitted to common knowledge, and that we support people's right to make fair use of copyrighted materials, but then we do have a takedown policy. And if it's really evident, and again, I don't want to be the police, but if it's really evident that something is egregiously not fair use, we will work with the submitter on that. But in general, we're not going to look at every page of every document that gets submitted. But again, that's something that you need to think about for your own institution. And so my recommendation to you, and again, there are many more issues, and as another shameless plug, I am actually writing a book on this topic that should be out sometime next year. But there are many ethical and legal issues that, and much more detail that we could go into, But I think at the most basic level, you should sit down and kind of identify what issues are relevant for you at your institution based on the type of material you include in your repository, that you need to communicate with your campus stakeholders like the registrar, like your IRB, like your university council, and specifically to find out with copyright, what's the risk tolerance for the institution? Are you going to require permission for everything? Are you going to provide some sort of support for fair use? And then finally, whatever you decide is appropriate for your institution, you need to incorporate that into a policy or your collection management plan for the repository. And that is really all. And I think, the last thing that I would say is that at Pacific, the story of our repository really is service. If we can use the repository to serve our community in any way, we will. And I think that that's kind of the not-so-secret of our success. So I will turn this back over.
Isaac, this is Pamela.
Yes.
You do have a few questions.
Okay.
Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to look at the questions and just go through them yourself?
I'm just trying to pull them up here. If you already have them up.
Well, I have them up, so let me start. The first question says that you alluded to SEO, and is wondering if you have any advice on that front.
On search engine optimization? This is going to be an unsatisfactory answer, but no, we don't have a lot of advice on that front. We haven't actively done a lot with search engine optimization. There is, because we use Digital Commons, there's a certain amount of that built into the hosted product that we're using, and we haven't gone beyond that.
Okay, well, we have another question, or more of a comment, really. This says, I have found that many faculty have little or no interest in whether the university as a whole looks good. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, I think that could potentially be true, and I think that's why, for us, it's important that that we tailor the message that we have. I was talking about talking to, at the administrative level, trying to create a context for them, but then also kind of at the individual and departmental level. And so at the individual faculty member level or within a department or school, the message might not be make the university look good. It might be, here's how this can support your school, your students, your discipline. And I think at the faculty member level, I found that to be most effective, that when we can present a way in which the repository can be used to support that faculty member's discipline or to support that faculty member's program, that's the most effective way to go. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Good. All right. So you may have already answered this, but the question is, can you elaborate on the level of copyright compliance work you provide for faculty?
Sure. So for faculty who submit previously published work, whether it's and so I'm speaking specifically about journal articles, we just tell them to send it to me, so they will email it to me, and I will, check SHRP or Romeo. I'll also check the publisher's website. If it's not clear what version of that article we can post, I will contact the publisher directly. So the faculty member doesn't need to be in the loop at all unless they really want to be, and I haven't found many that have volunteered to be in that loop. They're usually happy to let me do it on my own. With unpublished work, as I mentioned, we really don't police that as much because we do want to support the fair use of copyrighted material. So unless there's something that I see that is really egregious, I won't really say anything because I don't go through every page of everything that's submitted. But if I do see something that raises even my eyebrows, I will contact the faculty member and work with them directly to either see if we can find alternative sources of content or otherwise modify what they want to post to make it a little less risky.
Okay, so next we have another sort of question comment. So is there not the risk of the IR coming to be identified with administrators who are trying to herd faculty into collaborating with people across campus when they care most about colleagues in their discipline elsewhere?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking about that for a second. Um, I think that's a risk if you don't do outreach to faculty individually, either individually as people or individually as a department. But I think if all that we did was kind of set up the repository and present it to the administrators and say this is good for the university and we want you to help trickle it down, that's not going to. I mean, I'm a faculty member, so I feel like I can say this, that faculty are not too responsive to mandates that come down, and so that's obvious. And I think we just, as I mentioned before, we just present it in different ways. So the faculty members may ignore kind of why the administrators want them to use the repository, but we present them with other reasons to use it, and I think they're generally happy with using it for their own purposes. I hope that answers the question.
Next question. What obstacles did you encounter in implementing common knowledge?
None. Well, none is the short answer. As I mentioned, we really tried to lay some, I guess I'd say, philosophical groundwork with the Office for Research to create a partnership there, but then we also tried to lay some groundwork with individual departments like optometry. So there was interest in the repository from outside of the library, but internally the library director was completely on board. We also had, as much as I harp on external motivations, we also had internal motivations like digitizing our theses and dissertations, and so there were some practical internal reasons for us to implement it, and there was interest from outside, and that was enough for us to move forward. I feel like I'm pretty lucky in where I'm working, and it's a place that's willing to try things, and so we tried it, and it's working out pretty well.
All right, next question. Can you describe in more detail the publishing support services you mentioned?
Sure. So we are a small unit, and by small I mean me and one student assistant who I think worked maybe 40 hours last semester. So the publishing support we're able to provide is somewhat limited and varies by journal. At the most basic level, we will help with the initial setup of the journal site. So we'll help with some design work, for the banner. We'll help with designing a template for the articles, and then once it's up and running, we're also willing to help with providing some minor copy editing and kind of technical editorial help on the back end and actually getting the final issues published. In general, we like to leave the management of the peer review process to the editors and the faculty and other people that are involved with the journal. But it really does vary by journal. We have an undergraduate research journal where I do nothing for them anymore. They're managing that whole process, kind of the editorial and the production process. We have a philosophy journal where we help them get the site up, and we uploaded the back files, and now twice a year we help them get the new issue up by taking the Word documents and formatting them in the article template we provided and uploading the metadata. So it really varies. We're looking to expand what services we can provide. I think there's a interesting distinction that requires a longer conversation between what it means to host a journal and what it means to actually publish a journal. And I'll credit Roland Larimore at SFU with that distinction. But hopefully that gives you some sense of what we're doing.
Also, do you have an opinion about how to handle differences in disciplinary cultures?
Yes, differently. I think at Pacific we obviously have differences as we do anywhere else. I think some of the keenest ones, though, we're trying to, I think the institution as a whole is trying to negotiate them, is between some of our professional programs and, say, our undergraduate arts and sciences programs. And there are some different different interests and different concerns and different issues in both of those areas. And I think you really do, to a certain extent, need to be all things to all people. That obviously you're going to provide a core set of services, and there are some things you can do and some things you can't do. But for each different discipline, you need to try to understand their culture, try to understand what's important to them, and then how you can tailor what you have to offer to meet their needs. And then so there is no one-size-fits-all kind of approach to using the repository, I've found.
How much time does your team spend on the IR, or your team, you?
Yeah, the team of me, it's hard to break down, and we are, I think, certainly blessed by having a hosted product. So we have the support that comes from ePress, which is like having well, we do have a team, it's just not ours. And so I myself probably spend, I'm trying to think percentage-wise, maybe about 20% of my time on IR activities like managing some of the series, collections, getting new stuff up. So at this point, the actual management of the IR is probably one of the smaller parts of my job. I still do some instruction, and I have kind of the general scholarly communication portfolio, which includes other activities as well. So I would say about 20% of my time is specific to the IR, but it's kind of hard to pull it out from all the other activities because we have tried to intertwine them as closely as possible.
All right. I notice that it is already a little bit past 3, so I'll take one more question, and then, Isaac, if you would be willing to answer the remaining questions, which we are logging in writing, we will send the answers out to everybody when we send out the slides and the link to the recording. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
So the last question to take during the webinar is that you mentioned both perpetual access and preserve scholarly achievements. How are you assuring ongoing access?
So I may be guilty of using the word preservation too loosely, or loosey-goosey, but it is our because I'm perfectly aware that preservation does have a very specific meaning to it. It is our goal to provide perpetual access to the items that we add to the repository, and so there are obviously backup mechanisms in place. The URL and linking structure within Digital Commons is set up to be a persistent linking structure, but we are not currently taking advantage of more kind of robust preservation options like participating in a LOCKSS network. So we're kind of gradually moving in that direction, but I would say that currently our repository is much more presentation than preservation from a technical standpoint, but we are moving in the direction of implementing more preservation measures.
All right. Thank you, Isaac. I think we'll try to wrap this up now.
Okay.
So I wanted to thank Isaac for giving us so many ideas on how services can enhance the stature of the repository and for reminding us about our responsibilities as repository managers. Later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, you will receive a short online evaluation form about today's webinar. I hope you will take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. The ALCTS Continuing Education Committee takes your comments and suggestions very seriously and uses them in planning and shaping additional continuing education offerings on the topic of institutional repositories as well as on an array of other subjects. If you have an idea for a webinar, we would love to hear from you. You may contact me or submit a proposal using the form found on the ALCTS website. On April 4, we will offer another webinar on institutional repositories when Brad Matthews will shake things up a bit with challenging the status quo when the IR comes to access services. We hope you will join us for that presentation as well as other webinars on the spring 2012 schedule, a few of which are shown on your screen for the rest of February and early March. As we sign off this afternoon, I would like to thank Eva Sorrell and Yuan Lee, members of the ALCTS CE Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee, and Alyssa Novak in the ALCTS office for their assistance. And thank you to all our attendees for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to welcoming you at another ALCTS webinar in the future.